Good afternoon. Thank you for attending Youth Suicide Awareness and Prevention. My name is Keisha Herzog, and I'm from the Empowerment Program of Families Helping Families of Greater Baton Rouge. Dr. Marilyn Thornton is the Executive Director of Families Helping Families of Greater Baton Rouge. On behalf of Families Helping Families of Greater Baton Rouge, I would like to thank you for joining us this morning. Families Helping Family is a family-driven nonprofit resource center for individuals with disabilities and their families. Our mission is to provide the individualized services, information, and support needed to positively enhance the independence, productivity, and integration of persons with disabilities into the community. Our program includes the Bureau of Family Health, Early Steps, the Empowerment Program, Inclusive Education, the Resource Center for Autism Spectrum Disorder, and through the Louisiana Developmental Disability Council, LECAN, and Advocacy Network. Across all of our service areas, we provide information and referrals, education and training, and family-to-family and/or peer-to-peer support. Our empowerment program provides families in Louisiana with mental health, behavioral health, education skills, and resources to increase and strengthen their ability to function successfully. We provide in-person workshops, webinars, and parent caregiver professional monthly support virtual groups. We also have travel stipends to offer financial support to families to attend workshops and conferences. The stipend covers transportation, hotels, and meals. Please continue to check your email and our Facebook, Instagram, and X pages for upcoming events, workshops, and conference participation opportunities. Just a friendly reminder, our upcoming empowerment program and Families Helping Families events are as follows. So today we have Suicide Awareness and Prevention, which is a hybrid training. And of course, it's online and is at Families Helping Families of Greater Baton Rouge. We also have the Parents and Caregivers Networking virtual meeting scheduled on September 17th at 12 p.m. This meeting is for parents to share information on behavioral health services in Louisiana. Please note, if you do not feel comfortable sharing your story, you do not have to. But if you do share your story, please leave out details such as names, locations, and places. Top tips for an effective IEP meeting webinar is scheduled on September 18th at 12 p.m. presented by Ms. Cynthia Chesterfield, Inclusive Education Director of Families Helping Families of Greater Baton Rouge. And the Sunshine Social Disco Fever scheduled on September 20th at 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Please visit our website and our Facebook page to obtain the conference call information and our webinar and in-person training registration links. Please be advised that this presentation will be muted to all participants who are joining us by webinar. However, you can type your questions in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, I will give all attendees control of the mic if you have additional questions. Again, we appreciate you for joining. Now I turn it over to today's presenter, Ms. Clara Carruth of American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Let's welcome Ms. Carruth.
Okay. Stop. They're not going to see that if I move here, are they? They just see that. Okay. All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for welcoming me today. Again, my name is Clara. I am with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, and I am the programs manager for Louisiana and Mississippi. We know suicide can be a sensitive topic, but talking about suicide is critical to its prevention. So I'm grateful you've joined us for this important conversation. And if at any point during today's presentation you feel the need to step away, please feel free to do so. So overall, we hope you're able to learn more about suicide prevention from today's presentation and become more comfortable talking about this important issue, because talk saves lives. So like I mentioned, suicide can be a sensitive topic to discuss, but talking about it is critical to its prevention, and I'm grateful that you joined us today. So before we begin, please know that this presentation is intended for general audience education and is not suitable as a replacement for professional mental health services. This is a peer-to-peer program, and I'm presenting basically as a volunteer with AFSP, not an expert in suicide prevention or a mental health professional. So if you feel you need more information about finding professional services, we do have a resource list at the end of the presentation. And you can consult with your healthcare professional. Keep in mind that many organizations have their own guidance around what to do and what resources are available, and may be slightly different than our general information. So we also want to thank the Rain Will Bring Flowers Foundation for partnering with us this year to bring suicide information across the state of Louisiana, and in particular to students in primary and secondary schools. So this program was developed by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, which I'll call AFSP moving forward in this conversation. So AFSP's mission is to save lives and bring hope to those affected by suicide. We create a culture that prioritizes mental health, suicide prevention, and loss support through funding scientific research, educating the public about mental health, suicide prevention, and suicide loss through programs like the one I'm bringing to you today. Advocating for public policies that support mental health and suicide prevention, both at the local, state, and federal levels, and supporting survivors of suicide loss and others who've been affected by suicide. So just like physical health, we all have mental health, right? And mental health includes our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And the brain plays a big role in our mental health, as do many other factors. So the focus of this talk is going to be on helping individuals learn how to identify warning signs in both themselves and in others, and ways to help themselves or those in crisis. However, it's important to know that a really good, robust public health strategy is required for suicide prevention. And that includes things like implementing suicide prevention education and health promotion in all settings, from healthcare to schools to workplaces, changing social and cultural norms to decrease stigma behind suicide and to encourage others to seek help. Identify selective and targeted prevention strategies that are backed by research, and increasing access and awareness of effective treatment for mental health conditions like depression or anxiety, and for addressing suicidal thoughts and behavior, and the importance of receiving support throughout recovery. So advocating for health, economic, educational, and social policies that help reduce inequalities between groups in society and advance mental health care in underserved communities. AFSP supports work across these various strategies with the goal of creating a culture that effectively addresses suicide prevention. So AFSP believes that everybody has a role in reducing the risk of suicide. So by the end of this presentation, we hope you'll be able to describe the impact of suicide, identify contributors to suicide and some protective factors, understand how suicide might impact certain communities differently, describe how to recognize suicide warning signs, provide examples of how to start a conversation about suicide with somebody that you're concerned about, and list ways to seek and offer support and crisis resources for both yourself and for others. So if you or someone you know is in distress, you will know how to take action. So like I said, how we talk about suicide matters, and it's important that we use appropriate language so we don't perpetuate the stigma that's associated with suicide. So we want to avoid referring to suicide attempts as failed or successful. These words imply judgment. So we also want to avoid the phrase committed suicide because it can have a negative connotation. When you think of the word committed, it's frequently associated with a crime, murder, robbery, that kind of thing. So we want to step away from that and instead use phrases like died by suicide, ended their life, death by suicide or someone made a suicide attempt. And terms used to describe the individual who's lost someone to suicide include things like suicide loss survivor, survivor of suicide loss, suicide bereaved, or bereaved by suicide. And when we talk about a person who's made an attempt or struggled with suicidal thoughts, we describe those as someone with lived experience. And when someone has made a suicide attempt, we might also say that they're a suicide attempt survivor. So it's also important to avoid sharing graphic details about suicide methods, since this can actually be activating for those who struggle and can cause contagion. So we also avoid minimizing suicide to one single reason or cause, because many converging factors play a role in suicide. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. So when suicide is talked about safely and accurately, we can help reduce judgment and stigma around suicide and encourage those people at risk to seek help. And suicide is the leading cause of death in the United States. And in the US, nearly 50,000 people die by suicide each year. And there are also well over 1 million people who survive a suicide, have survived a suicide attempt, and millions more who have thoughts of suicide each year. So the impact of suicide on families, friends, and communities is really wide-reaching, and even long after a person has taken their life. So the majority of people who've been affected by, the majority of people have been affected by suicide in some way. All populations are affected by suicide, but there are numerous factors that contribute to the differences in suicide rates for certain populations. Things like access to healthcare and support, experiences of marginalization, and access to lethal means. So while at a population level, some communities experience more negative conditions or factors that increase risk for suicide, and identifying as any part of these communities doesn't mean that the individual is inherently at risk of dying by suicide. But on this slide, you'll see the various examples of groups with differing rates of suicide. For example, males have a higher risk than females. Middle-aged and older adults have higher rates of suicide than younger people, although we are seeing an increase in those in the ages of between 10 and 24. Veterans have a higher rate of suicide than non-veterans, and suicide rates are 3 times higher in homes where there's a firearm than those without. Youth still have the lowest suicide rates compared to other groups, but unfortunately the suicide rate in this group has been on the rise. Suicide rates are lower among people of color, but those rates are also increasing faster. And suicide rates among Black and Asian American and Pacific Islander youth are found to be increasing, like rates among other racial and ethnic groups of color. Indigenous youth and young adults die by suicide at a higher rate than any other racial or ethnic group. And finally, although research is lacking, we suspect some groups have higher rates of suicide, including people with disabilities and LGBTQ communities. So there is data demonstrating higher rates of thoughts of suicide and suicide attempts within those communities. So in the US, most people who die by suicide are people of working age. And the CDC classifies occupations into major groupings by industry and occupational groups. And you can see the highest rate groups listed here. So we've got things like what we have here in Louisiana, a lot of oil and gas extraction and construction services. And we've also got the agriculture and forestry, fishing and hunting, transportation and warehousing, and the occupational groups, construction and extraction, arts, design and entertainment, sports and media, and healthcare support. So when someone dies by suicide, loved ones and friends may see things like a life event or life stressors like losing a job or a breakup or bad grades or bullying, and assume that that event caused the suicide. However, that's not how it works. There is not one single cause for suicide, so it's important to keep in mind that most people who experience a tough life event or a stressor will not think about suicide, much less die by suicide. But behind the scenes, there are multiple risk factors that can converge to contribute to that risk of suicide. And these factors may or may not be noticeable, including biological, psychological, and environmental factors. So most people will never act on thoughts of suicide, even though they have increased risk. And this is because protective factors are also present. And most of the factors are dynamic and always changing. So a crisis can occur if a person has several contributors to underlying risk, like a depressive condition, a substance use problem, or maybe a physical health condition worsening. And then the person experiences one or more stressors that in that moment feel unsolvable. And research shows that cognitive changes during that brief period of increased risk often creates a sort of tunnel vision due to what we call cognitive constriction, right? That makes that hopelessness and suicidal urges more intense. And if they have access to lethal means, they may die by suicide. So this is the reason that removing access to lethal means and keeping that person safe in their moment of crisis is so important. So now we'll talk about some of the potential contributions or contributors to suicide risk and suicidal behavior. So these are those biological, psychological, and social and environmental factors that can converge to contribute to suicide risk. So as we learned earlier, most people who've died by suicide had at least one mental health condition at the time of their death. Depression, bipolar disorder, and substance use, among other health conditions, are strongly linked to suicidal thinking and behavior. Past suicide attempts may also indicate risk for future suicidal behavior. However, past behaviors alone don't predestine someone to suicide. Notably, the vast majority, about 90% of people who have survived a past attempt will not go on to die by suicide. Now, a family history of suicide or mental health conditions, as well as exposure to suicide, does contribute to risk. Physical health conditions and chronic pain can also increase risk, particularly following the disclosure of a diagnosis. And traumatic brain injury can lead to depression, difficulty with problem solving, impulsivity, aggression, or disability, all of which might increase a person's risk. And things like adverse childhood experiences, including growing up witnessing and experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect, or the loss of a family member through divorce, death, or prison, are also important risk factors for suicide. So lastly, I want to highlight some social factors that contribute to suicide risk, including the presence of severe ongoing interpersonal conflict, rejection by one's loved ones, rejection by one's family, victimization, race or gender-related discrimination, prejudice, systemic racism, and historical trauma. These can all increase vulnerability to suicide. So while we talked a lot about the risk factors and the contributors to suicidal behavior, there are also protective factors that can reduce a person's risk. These include coping skills and sources of strength and resilience, and a person's resilience to overcome difficult and challenging barriers in their life, their ability to connect with other people who can provide emotional support and ground them in a sense of connection, and support from the people who love them can really mitigate the impact of the risk factors. So also a person's willingness to participate in mental health care, as well as the availability and access to that care, does play an important role. Participating in mental health care can be life-saving. So it's important to note that while protective factors are powerful and important, even individuals with many protective factors can still experience a suicidal crisis. We just need to remember that the cause of suicide is really complex. So if anyone can experience suicide risk, why do certain groups and populations have higher rates? So in this audience, we have people who are members of different communities, people who might have different gender identities, younger and older adults, people with lived experience of suicide. There may be an attempt survivor or survivors of suicide loss. We might have some service members or veterans and their families, members of the LGBTQ communities. I'm sure people who live in rural or urban areas, differing ethnicities and cultures, people with different occupations, and the list goes on, right? So in the next few slides, we'll explore potential factors that increase suicide risk for certain communities. However, keep in mind that identifying as part of one or more of these communities does not mean you're inherently at risk for suicide. What most people have overlapping identities and varying experiences that contribute to both risk and protective factors. So for individuals over the age of 65, certain circumstances may increase their risk for suicide. For example, older adults who live alone may have an increased feeling of isolation. They're more likely to have experienced a loss of a life partner, close friends, or a family member. Losing a pet can also be really significant, especially if they're living alone. Changes in their health care can lead to a loss of independence, and major role changes like retiring can put older adults at risk, especially those whose career played a really important role for them in their life as their identity. It's also essential to understand that depression is not a natural part of growing older. It's a treatable health condition, and if left untreated, it can be life-threatening. So when older adults attempt to end their life, those attempts more often result in death. Reasons for that include things like they live alone, they have greater access to lethal means, including medications, and the increased likelihood that they might have a serious health condition that would make them less likely to survive a suicide attempt. So supporting older adults through change and stressors can help, and having that caring conversation, helping them discover new hobbies together, or encouraging some community connectedness can also make a difference. And people who identify as LGBT experience more suicidal ideation and suicide attempts than their heterosexual peers. While data on suicidality among transgender individuals is limited, one study found that the prevalence of transgender individuals who made a suicide attempt in their lifetime was almost 9 times the lifetime prevalence of suicide attempts in the US population overall. And while identifying as a member of that community doesn't make you inherently make a person at risk for dying by suicide, research shows that at least part of the reason for elevated rates for suicidality is stigma, prejudice, and discrimination that's associated with minoritized sexual orientation and gender expression. So as mentioned earlier, most people who die by suicide did have a mental health condition at the time of their death, and studies have reported a generally strong association between mental health conditions and suicide attempts in LGBT adolescents and adults. So for youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bi, trans, a common and powerful stressor is the rejection by parents and other family members. So in addition to protective factors that we discussed earlier, such as social support, resilience, and connectedness, increasing acceptance and affirmation of their identities and increasing access to affirming care, physical or mental health care can help protect against suicide risk. So for more than a decade, suicide rates have been higher and have risen faster among veterans as compared to non-veterans. The suicide rate for veterans is 1.5 times higher than that of the general population. And while veterans are vulnerable to the same risk and precipitating factors of suicide as other people in the population, they're more likely to experience homelessness, unaddressed health or mental health issues, and struggle with personal relationships. And among US adults who die by suicide, firearms are more commonly involved in veteran deaths, with nearly 75% of veteran suicide involving the firearm. So firearm ownership is over twice as prevalent among veterans than for non-veterans. And 1 in 3 veteran firearms owners store at least one firearm locked and loaded, or unlocked, excuse me, unlocked and loaded. Occupational risk factors for veterans suicide includes previous exposure to trauma, including events from earlier pre-military service, military sexual trauma, or combat exposure, and transition back to civilian life, particularly in the first year following their separation from the military, can come with a lost sense of identity and even new challenges. So although not unique to veterans, loneliness and loss of peer connection are risk factors for suicide that can be heightened during their transition period. So veterans who've attempted suicide were more likely to have a diagnosable mental health condition, including things like post-traumatic stress disorder, major depressive disorder, substance use, generalized anxiety, and having poor sleep quality. And many veterans also have a higher perceived stigma about mental health care. So strategies to prevent veteran suicide are things like addressing common misperceptions about firearm risk, teaching safe storage strategies, increase access to and use of mental health services, and increased support for transitioning veterans and service members are also strategies that can be protective. So veterans often show resilience in the face of challenge, and a community of peers to support them can be a protective factor. So it's important to emphasize that while there might be increased suicide rates among veterans population as a whole, doesn't mean that every individual veteran is at risk, right? So we just remember that suicide is complex for each individual, let alone an entire population. We just can't generalize what happens with one person to all of those in that. It's not supposed to even show up. Okay, so sorry about that. Blank screen, yes. So now that we understand how some of the different groups are affected by suicide, we'll explore the experience of someone who's struggling with thoughts of suicide and suicide behaviors. So keep in mind that thoughts of suicide are complex and each person has their own path to feeling suicidal or attempting. And we've learned that most people who experience suicidal behaviors are basically ambivalent about taking their life. Part of them wants to live, but part of them wants to die and end their pain. And the thought of ending their life is usually part of their mind's problem-solving process. It's not that they really want to die or that they're preoccupied with morbid ideas or death. Rather, it's suicide might come to mind as a possible solution to the suffering. And they may think that if they weren't around, it would be better for their family and friends. And some may feel that their psychological or physical pain or feeling trapped will never change. And they may feel just overwhelmed with hopelessness. So it's important to remember that what we discussed earlier, that millions of people have thoughts of suicides each year, but most of those don't go on to make an attempt. And thoughts of suicide don't necessarily lead to suicidal behaviors, but suicidal thoughts always do signal distress that needs support and professional evaluation. So when a person reaches that moment of crisis, thinking basically becomes really constricted, kind of a state of intense tunnel vision. And in that moment, they really don't see other options. And in that brief period of crisis, they can't foresee a time when that unbearable pain will end and may become so focused on suicide as a way to end that pain. And thoughts of suicide are often temporary, and research provides clear evidence that in a moment of crisis, time and distance can be a life-saving measure. Time for that intense crisis moment to pass, and distance between that individual and their method of ending their life can really be a life-saving action. So the good news is that there are things we can all do to help save lives and prevent suicide. So in the next few slides, we'll learn about the importance of watching out for the warning signs, how to reach out to someone you're worried about, and have that honest conversation, how to keep their environment safe, and knowing what other resources are out there and available to help yourself or others to seek help. So first step in suicide prevention is watching for warning signs. And we know while risk factors often endure over a longer period of time, warning signs are actually observable signs that someone might be suicidal. For example, high blood pressure or high cholesterol are risks that may increase the chance of a heart attack, right? But chest pains is a warning sign because it signals that a heart attack might actually be happening. So we're going to kind of make that comparison here. Suicide warning signs are typically displayed in three main ways that we can detect: through talk, behavior, and mood. So you might look at the list on this slide and take note of some of the common warning signs. So talk. Many people are surprised to learn that those who experience suicidal ideation often talk about it. And it's important to listen for those comments, like they might say they have no reason to live, or they feel like they're a burden. They feel trapped, or maybe they say something like they're in unbearable pain. So sometimes people also talk about ending their life like a joke. And I encourage you to take those comments seriously and use them as a way to open a conversation. So their behavior, you might notice someone acting differently than they usually do. And if you do, speak to that person about what you're noticing. You might see increased alcohol or drug use. Maybe they're having trouble sleeping, either sleeping too much or having trouble falling asleep and staying asleep. They may start acting more recklessly. They might withdraw from activities, especially things that you know they normally enjoy. And one example I give there is you've got a friend who's on the baseball team or the football team, and they've loved playing their entire life, and then suddenly they don't even want to go to practice. They're late, or they don't show up, or they don't go to the game. That's a signal that you need to look for. They might isolate themselves from their family and friends. They might also be looking for a way to kill themselves, like searching online for methods or shopping for a firearm. And no matter what it might be, the most important thing is to look for a change from a person's typical behavior. So now we'll talk about mood. So people all at risk for suicide can often display, often quite subtly, any of these listed moods: depression, anxiety, rage, apathy, irritability, impulsivity, humiliation. Moods you might expect from someone who's feeling a little overwhelmed and desperate. So we know we all have ups and downs in our lives, but if you notice something that seems uncharacteristic or concerning, it's really important that you speak to that individual about what you're noticing. For example, if somebody's suddenly happy and upbeat mood when they've been in a period of depression for a while, that can indicate they've actually made a plan and are relieved that they're no longer going to be in pain. So remember, it never hurts to trust your guts, trust your gut, trust your instincts, and start a conversation about how someone is doing. So the second step is to have that actual conversation. And it's important that it be a caring and supportive conversation with somebody you might be worried about. And you don't want to assume that somebody else is going to reach out to them, because if you notice the warning signs, you should start that conversation. So before we go a little further, I want to acknowledge how difficult, uncomfortable, or scary that having that kind of conversation can be. And it helps to remember that everybody has mental health, and talking about it in a non-judgmental way actually shows that you're a trusted person. And even if the person you're worried about doesn't want to get help at that particular moment, they will know that you are somebody they can turn to in the future. So if suicide turns out not to be a concern, they may still be in some distress and may feel comforted and supported just by knowing that you actually cared enough to ask. So in the next few slides, we'll walk through how to have an honest conversation and provide some examples of what you might say. You can also check out afsp.org/realconvo for some additional examples on how to start that conversation. So before you reach out to someone you're concerned about, you want to keep a few things in mind. First, you want to avoid minimizing their feelings. Second, avoid getting into debates about life being worth living, because if someone's nearing a crisis point, they're not really thinking clearly, and those kind of conversations about life being worth living tend not to be helpful. You want to avoid giving advice on how to fix it, because if a person were having a heart attack, you wouldn't tell them to start exercising and eat better. So the same is true for someone who's in mental health crisis or distress. And lastly, it's not your role to provide mental health services unless you are a licensed mental health professional. So your role would be to encourage that person to connect with available resources on mental health support. And if they are in crisis, what they need is to be heard and connected to help. So we'll provide some examples here on how you might start the conversation, like ask to talk to the person in private first and allow them to share what they're experiencing. I give this presentation a lot to college students, and I say, don't call them out at a party. Don't call them out when you're out to dinner with a bunch of friends. Take them aside and have a conversation. And start with an expression of care, followed by what you've observed and what led you to your concern, and let them know you're not going to judge them. So let's look at some examples of what you could say. Things like, I care about you and I noticed you haven't been yourself lately. You seem more frustrated or angry, distant than you've been in a while. And I'm wondering how you're really doing. Or I care about you and I noticed you haven't been yourself lately. I just did that one. Or you're an important friend to me, or colleague, coworker. You don't seem like yourself, and I wonder if something's happening these days stressing you out. Is everything okay? Or I've missed seeing you at the gym. With everything that's going on in your life, I wondered if you're feeling a little overwhelmed. You want to talk about it? So now that you've started that conversation, you want to listen with empathy. You want to listen with care. Active listening shows that you care and allows you to gain more information about their level of distress. And asking open-ended questions to encourage the person to share. Be aware of your words and body language and listen for those warning signs. Remember that everybody's experiences are different, and what impacts one person might not affect somebody else. You might say something like, well, how did that make you feel? You know, I hear you and I'm here for you. Well, that sounds really tough. I'm sorry you're hurting. I see that. I want to help you find the help that you need. And while some people worry that asking someone about suicide directly will put the idea in their head or push them into action, research actually shows that that's not true. If you think someone's considering suicide, trust your gut and ask them directly, are you thinking about ending your life? Are you thinking about suicide? Continue to listen and continue to provide your support. Because if they tell you that they're not thinking about suicide, but they are struggling with their mental health or going through a really hard time, here are some things that you can say. I'm sorry you're hurting so much. I care about you and I want you to be safe. I want to help you find the help that you need. And if someone tells you they're thinking about suicide, stay calm. And just because someone's having thoughts of suicide, it doesn't mean that they're in immediate danger. Take the time to calmly listen to what they have to say and ask some follow-up questions. You might ask, do you have a plan to end your life? Do you have a method? Do you have that available? Can you give that to me or to someone else who can hold it for you during this difficult struggle? I want to be here to help you. So make sure you avoid saying things like, you have too much to live for, or think about what this will do to your parents or your spouse or your kids. And like I mentioned earlier, if that person is nearing a crisis point, they're really not thinking clearly, and these phrases tend not to be very helpful. So instead, you want to reassure them that there is help available and that these feelings are a signal that it's time to talk to a mental health professional. And if you think they might make a suicide attempt soon, try to stay with them and help them remove any lethal means. You can escort them to mental health services or an emergency room. But if your own safety is at risk, leave the area immediately and call 911. Give as much detail and information about what is going on as you can on the call. So to close that conversation, reiterate that you're so glad for the chance to connect on this kind of level, on this deeper level about such a meaningful subject and the things in their life. Remind them that we all have challenges at times and that you'll continue to be there for them. But just don't leave it at that. Let them know you'll stay in touch and then actually follow up. So here are some examples for that too. Thank you for sharing with me. Do you want me to help you call your therapist tomorrow before we play basketball? Or, you know, you've been on my mind since we had that conversation the other day. How are you doing today? And I've really been thinking about what we talked about, and I just want to circle back with you. How have you been feeling since we talked? So now we'll watch an example of a video from AFSP's Talk Away the Dark campaign that shows how to start a conversation. I'm hoping sound works. If it doesn't, we'll skip it.
Dad, are you okay?
Yeah, just stressed out.
So in the next few slides, we're going to explore the third step in suicide prevention, keeping the environment safe. The most important thing you can put between a person's thinking about suicide and their way of ending their life is time. Research shows that by temporarily reducing a person's access to lethal means, we give those individuals time for the intense suicide risk to diminish, and time for someone to intervene with mental health support and resources. So even before someone reaches a crisis point, keeping the environment safe is a great way to protect and proactively reduce suicide risk. So lethal means refers to a method that can be fatal if one uses it to attempt suicide. And limiting access to lethal means involves securing and reducing access to those methods, especially in the home environment. And it's a proven strategy that works in suicide prevention. So for the most people in suicidal crisis, if they're unable to access that chosen method, even temporarily, they're unlikely to look for an alternate way to end their life. So therefore, like I said, clear way to prevent suicide is limiting that access to lethal means. When a person's plan involves firearms and they are unable to access them, if they do try another method to end their life, it's less likely to be as dangerous or as deadly. And during a period of high risk, the safer their environment is, the better chance a person experiencing a suicidal crisis has of living through that crisis moment. So now let's talk about a few examples of how one might limit access to lethal means. So for firearms, strategies for secure storage to lock, limit, or temporarily remove. So before locking firearms in a safe, ensure they're unloaded and disassembled. Have a trusted person change the lock or the combination, or use a cable lock, and give someone you trust the key to hold temporarily. You can limit or delay access by storing firearms, magazines, and ammunition in 3 separate locked locations. Or you could store ammunition with a trusted person temporarily. The strategy that has proven the most effective at saving lives is to temporarily remove firearms from the home, storing them at a trusted off-site location. So please keep in mind that laws regarding firearm transfers vary from state to state. I know there are some gun shops and some like pawn shops that will temporarily hold weapons in Louisiana. So there are options for that as well. So other ways to restrict lethal means are to secure medications, including over-the-counter medications, and to secure toxic substances. So you might ask the person you're concerned about what they need to feel safer and encourage them to refrain from substance use and encourage them to discuss keeping their environment safe with a mental health professional. So a major part of keeping the environment safe involves safe storage of firearms. So we want to highlight why this is such an important strategy to help save lives. Nearly half of all U.S. households have at least one firearm. And we know in Louisiana that rate is higher. So if someone is at risk for suicide, having a gun in the home can be fatal. So around half of all suicides in the U.S. involves firearms. And in some states, firearms are used in as many as 70% of most suicides. More firearm deaths in the U.S. are suicides. And this information tells us how important it is to ensure that firearms are stored safely. Taking action to lock, limit, or temporarily remove firearms can help save lives. And the fourth and final step to preventing suicide is connecting the individual to resources. So if someone has a suicidal plan or is in a crisis and not safe, we need to take immediate action. So 988 is the National Suicide Crisis Lifeline. Every time I give a presentation, I ask people in the audience how many people have heard of the 988 number, and it's always less than half. So how many in the room have heard of 988? Yeah. So 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. 988 provides free and confidential emotional support to people in suicidal crisis and emotional distress, and they are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's comprised of a national network of more than 200 local crisis centers, combining custom local care and resources with national standards and best practices. And if you call on behalf of someone else, a trained counselor will provide guidance about what you should do to help a person in distress. In addition to phone access, 988 also provides text and chat options with specialty guidance for veterans, LGBTQ+ people, and it's also available in Spanish. And in the state of Washington, they also offer an option for Native tribal communities. And if you don't speak English or Spanish, there are another 250 additional languages offered through Language Line Solutions. So if you or a person you're concerned about don't feel comfortable speaking to a counselor on the phone, another option is to text 988, or you can also text the crisis text line at 741-741 in either English or Spanish. And the crisis text line is also free, available 24/7, has high quality text-based mental health support and crisis intervention by a community of trained volunteers. 988 also offers options for individuals who are deaf or hard of hearing through text, online chat, or video phone at 988lifeline.org. And with the crisis text line, I understand that their conversations when they're texting with someone generally last anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes. And there are also resources for LGBTQ community and allies. LGBTQ+ youth may connect with a crisis counselor via the Trevor Project. And additionally, there's the Trans Lifeline, is a free peer support phone service run by trans people for trans and questioning peers. And also, the emergency department at your local hospital is another resource for immediate care. So I noticed you took your phone out. I was going to say, please feel free to take a picture of this slide. I'll leave this up for just a few minutes while I kind of go over what happens when you use them. So with 988, callers get a greeting message, and then their call is routed to the local Lifeline Network Crisis Center based on their area code. So when I give this to students, I say, if you're here from Texas, and you call for a friend or for yourself, it's gonna route you to the Texas location which is fine. They're all equally trained well. Just know that you're not talking to somebody who's like 5 miles away from you. So it's based on their area code. So the trained counselor answers the phone, listens to the caller, understands how the problem is affecting them, provides support, and shares resources if needed. If the local crisis center is unavailable or unable to take the call is automatically routed to the National Backup Call Center. So they'll get somebody. The Lifeline provides live crisis center services in English and Spanish and uses language line solutions for 250 more. You can learn more at 8988lifeline.org. And when texting the crisis text line, you text TALK for English. And if anybody knows Spanish and I say it wrong, I'd love to know how to pronounce this, but ayuda for Spanish. They're greeted with 2 automated response, and it usually takes less than 5 minutes to connect them to that crisis counselor. And when they reach their counselor, the counselor introduces themselves, reflects on what has been, what conversation has gone on so far, reflects on what was shared, and invites them to continue to share at their own pace. The goal of those conversations is to get that texter to a calm, safe place. Sometimes that might mean giving them a referral for further help, or sometimes it's just someone there and actually listening to them. Like I mentioned, 15 to 45 minutes are their average calls. And if there's a medical emergency or life-threatening situation, such as a suicide attempt in progress, call 911. And while 911 can be life-saving, it may not be the best choice if you don't want law enforcement to respond. We acknowledge there's an increased risk of death for people of color experiencing a mental health crisis when 911 is involved. And when calling 911, provide as much detail as possible about the situation, and know that even if you convey a lot of information to dispatch, it may or may not get passed on to the responding officers. So be prepared to explain when they arrive on site. One alternative to 911 in many communities is mobile crisis unit. Calls are responded to on site, whether it's at work, home, school, wherever, by licensed mental health professionals with the goal of preventing a crisis from becoming an emergency and referring that client to mental health resources. And another option is your local emergency room or an urgent care center. So seeking mental health care is considered a sign of strength, and connecting to a mental health professional is important before a point of crisis and for ongoing support. A mental health professional is someone who can help people get relief from mental health conditions and find ways to improve mental wellness and resiliency. And it might be a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a social worker, marriage and family counselor, a psychiatric nurse, a licensed mental health counselor, or any other counselor with mental health training. And you can find those professionals in emergency departments, hospitals, clinics, schools, communities, and religious centers, and in private practice. You can find a behavioral health provider by going to findtreatment.samhsa.gov, mentalhealthamerica.net, finding-help, or inclusivetherapist.com, all listed there on the screen. So the person seeking help should request a thorough evaluation to figure out if there's a mental health condition affecting their life. There are many types of treatment available, right? Like various types of psychotherapy and medications. And research has shown that for many people, the combination of psychotherapy and medications tends to be the most helpful. Developing a safety plan can also be helpful for many individuals. The most important thing is connecting with a mental health professional to find the right treatment plan that works best for that individual, because everybody's different. So acknowledge that there are barriers to accessing care, including the lack of mental health professionals, including especially with therapists of color or LGBTQ affirming therapists, and culturally responsive therapists. Other barriers to accessing care can include navigating health insurance, the cost, and being able to take the time off to go. So while it should be easier to find a provider, there are ways to find treatment, including for people without insurance through local social services agency or your local health department. And telehealth or virtual therapy is also a great option for those who have a limited amount of time. Well, that's blank. Again, I apologize for that. So we learned earlier in the presentation that experience of suicidal loss is also a risk factor for suicide. So providing support for loss survivors is important and another way to prevent suicide. So I encourage you to take a picture of this slide too in case you ever need it, and check out some of those resources. We've got AFSP resources, of course, and the Dougie Center for Grieving Children and Families, Tragedy Assistance Program for Militaries and Veterans, Alliance of Hope for Suicide Providers, the American Association of Suicidology. In addition to those listed on the slide, AFSP offers resources to support loss for survivors, including our Healing Conversations program, which I'll explain in just a minute, and International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day. So Healing Conversation is a one-time visit, whether that's by phone, in person, or chat, to connect those who've lost a loved one to suicide with one of our trained volunteers who is also a suicide loss survivor. The goal of the connection is to help recent survivors navigate those challenging times and offering support, connectedness, and resources. And we do try to match the person who's calling in with someone who's had a similar loss. So like if someone has lost a brother or sister, we match them with someone who's lost a sibling. If they've lost a child, we match them to someone who's lost a child. And unfortunately, we have a relatively large pool of volunteers in Louisiana. So fortunately or unfortunately, it's great for the people who are calling in, but it's not great for the fact that there are that many people. The goal of that connection is just to help them navigate the challenging journey, offer support and connection and resources. And then International Survivors of Suicide Loss Day is the Saturday before Thanksgiving in November. And it's a day in which survivors of suicide loss can come together and find connection, understanding, and hope through their shared experiences. We have them virtually and we have some in person too. So remember the protective factors we talked about earlier in the presentation. So in addition to professional mental health care, proactive self-care strategies like good sleep habits, exercise, nutrition, and stress management can all play a crucial role in protecting mental health and promoting resilience. So we encourage you to make time for your own self-care regularly and connect to activities and people that make you feel supported. Before we close, I'm going to share a short video that provides a summary of what we've covered today. I want to thank you for attending this presentation. Together, we can create a culture that prioritizes mental health and suicide prevention. So please help us measure the impact of the survey. We'll have a QR code in the next slide that you can scan, or the link that you can go to just to kind of let us know how we're doing and whether or not you'd recommend the program and ways we can improve it, because this is actually a new and improved version from what I think I brought last year. So here's the QR code and the link if you want to snag that real quick, and just come. You can wait until we're done and hang up, and then you can do that survey once you have it on your phone. But it really does help a lot for us to know what's working and what's not. And we can always share this after the fact if we need to too. Okay. So I want to take just a moment to share other ways to participate in suicide prevention and loss support. If you're interested, you can join up with your local chapter. We do have one here in Baton Rouge. You can become an advocate and send emails to your legislators or attend our day at the Capitol. You can attend a training, and you can even become a volunteer presenter and present something like Talk Saves Lives. We're also looking for connections into the community. We want to work with schools to teach our It's Real Teens program to middle school and high school students. You can walk in your community, and I'll share the list of the walks we have coming up this fall. You can partner to bring suicide prevention to your community, to your church, your community groups, anything like that. You can sponsor an event, give a gift, or engage with our social media accounts. So we would like you to invite you to join us at any of our annual Out of the Darkness walks. The one in Baton Rouge will be October 19th at Pennington Biomedical, and we take the 1 mile hike around the lake. But we'll have booths and tables of information about suicide prevention and suicide awareness and ways you can work with us in the community. You can start a team, join a team, raise money, join the committee, or just show up on walk day. Excuse me. And thanks to our generous walk supporters, programs like this, Talk Saves Lives, are offered at no cost to communities across the country here in Louisiana. And we have the community walks in hundreds of cities around the country. So you can see we've got 6 in Louisiana and 4 in Mississippi. That people across the country are the core of our Out of the Darkness movement, which began in 2004. And these events give people the courage to open up and talk about their own connections to the cause, and a platform to create a culture that's smart about mental health. Friends, family members, neighbors, coworkers all walk side by side, supporting each other in memory of those we've lost to suicide. So this is the conclusion. Thank you for joining us for Talk Saves Lives, and you can follow us on any of our socials. And I'm not going to show you the 3 pages worth of references. If you want them, email me at ccaruth@afsp.org and I will send them to you. Thank you. Do you want to open it up for questions? Anybody's got any questions?
I don't see any questions right now. Did you hear me in the beginning? Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. Anybody have any questions? Okay. So I want to thank everyone again for attending Youth Suicide awareness and prevention. And again, please visit our website and our Facebook page to obtain all webinars and in-person training registration links. Also, there's a survey at the end of the webinar. Please take a moment to answer a few questions. We greatly appreciate your feedback. A short survey takes about a few minutes to fill out. Thank you for attending today's event. It has been an honor to have you present. A certificate of attendance will be granted to all participants. We hope to see you at our next training. Please keep visiting our website, check your emails, our Facebook, Instagram, and X pages for upcoming events and their details. Have a great day.
Tell you.